Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, June 16th of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor, and an academician gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is June 21st, and each Tuesday we simply call in from wherever we may be, our homes, our travels, our hotels, at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. And if you're focusing on the Gospel Lectionary this week or preparing for a virtual discussion group during the pandemic, we hope this will provide areas of focus and reflection. And here's our approach. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information or questions on what the lead-off person on the call would like to discuss. And then we develop perspectives and share, encourage, and challenge each other. After we've read the text, Charles Willard will share some opening perspectives about what we call What Would They Have Heard? And this will help us consider the differences in authors, purposes in the writing, and the challenges of time and culture. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Sara Mickelson.
Bill Hall.
There's Charles Willard. And I'm Don Upton. And Sara, you got the lead off in the scripture reading today. Hello, my friend.
Good morning, everybody. And we are continuing on in the book of Matthew from where we left off last week, starting with verse 24 in chapter 10, and we're reading through 39. Starting with verse 24. A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher and the slave to be like the master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both the soul and the body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. And even the hairs on your head will all be counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I also will deny before my Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. For those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake find it. And that ends our scripture for today. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Don, I thought it was
get started. Yeah, Charles, could you give us a few perspectives on the time and place of this gospel?
Yes, thank you very much, Don. I wanted to make just basically one observation, and that is that in this instance, what we have, if you look through the other Gospels, and you will all know that sometimes you find that the 4 Gospels sort of line up and are saying the same thing. Other times, only one of the Gospels is speaking about it, and the other 3 are silent on that particular event or that particular certain circumstance. In this instance, Mark is very little present in parallel in this particular section, but Luke and Matthew are very closely aligned, but not precisely. And I want to lift up one instance in which there's a there's a peculiar difference, and I have no explanation for it. I don't recall having read anybody that explained it well. There's some made humorous comments about it, but it's in the 31st. It's in the 29th verse of Matthew. Are not two sparrows sold for a penny? And the parallel section in the Gospel of Luke is, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? And I have no explanation as to why, what the difference is, why one was selected, why they did it the way it is. It's just that it's a difference, and it's just simply important for us to recognize that these were not writers who were trying to spell out exactly what happened, but they were trying to spell out exactly what their understanding of what happened had for the audience, the people, the group, the party, if you will, for whom they were writing this. So it was a very deliberate intention to do it in the way that they did it. Thanks.
Thanks. All right, Sara, you got the questions today. What do you have in store for us?
Well, I want to thoughtfully make a comment about Charles's economic observation. Perhaps the economies were different at the time of the writing, or I like the idea that audiences were different. So wherever Luke was, sparrows were more expensive, or is that the opposite? Wherever Matthew was, the sparrows were more expensive. So that's kind of an interesting idea. Starting us off this week, it's interesting that in this passage, Jesus reminds the disciples as they're going out to not be afraid more than once, 3 times in this passage. So I find that comforting, considering how ill-equipped, or what's the right word, not very knowledgeable I am to move forward and to speak to people about the kingdom of heaven. So that the working against fear or with fear kind of prompted my questions this week. And question number 1, why do you think Jesus tells his disciples in detail about what they will encounter as they go out to share the kingdom of God is near? And how might that thinking shape the way you share the same message? Who wants to take the first crack? Bill, are you muted?
I'll make a comment.
Okay, Charles.
Go ahead, Charles. Go ahead.
I'm only going to use this opportunity to remind us that we have no way of knowing what Jesus was thinking. We have no way of knowing what Jesus had in mind. We just that information is completely inaccessible to us. And we need to understand that as we talk about what Jesus meant and why he said this. We don't know why he said that because we can't read his mind. All we can know is how what he said would have been heard by the disciples at that time. That's as close as we can get.
All right, I'll jump in. The challenge of mute, unmute. and maybe it was providential that Charles went first, because I'm in a sense, what I want to share briefly as a springboard and maybe a little bit of a challenge to what Charles said. I would agree. I've said this before. Part of the power of Scripture often is that Jesus doesn't tell us exactly what he means. For example, love your enemies. Well, who's my enemy? What's the checklist? We don't have that. And I think there's power in that. Here's where I would start. I think part of the power of Scripture are nuances. And it took various readings before I discovered that it is not true that Jesus in this passage only says, do not be afraid. In fact, at one point in verse 28, he says, fear the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Jesus tells us to fear something. Now, granted, Charles, I don't know exactly what that means, but I think we can make some informed inferences, at least about part of what Jesus meant by this and why, as you noted, Sara, he actually refers to fear 4 times. One was what I just said, and the other 3 was the do not fear. And a scholar I'm going to quote several times today is Stanley Saunders, who's a professor at Columbia Seminary. And on this, he makes what for me was a helpful point, and I'll paraphrase it briefly. He says that one of the things that helps us deal with fear is to have the source of that, the content of that named. Now, that's a somewhat more modern psychological, if you name what you feel, you're better able to deal with it. If you can give voice in some way to what's going on in you. So that's one of his points, is that by telling the disciples not to fear, but Jesus goes on and does give some content to that as to what that's about. Also, this scholar talks about the challenge of the gospel in terms of the current powers that be. And then I'll read this brief quote. The answers to fear, then, include clear-eyed recognition of the facades of human power, even those rooted in the threat of death, awareness of the conflict and division the gospel inevitably produces, and especially the deep awareness and conviction that God is present in the world in mercy and compassion. Again, his point is, if we have some understanding of the shape and content of what we're afraid of, we're better equipped to deal with it. It's like I wasn't the only minister colleague that shared this. If we were considering a call to another church, in one form or other, at some point, we would, because pulpit committees, it's like a courtship. We're all putting our best foot forward. And then the wise ones of it at some point would say, okay, now that's the good stuff. What are the potholes that I need to be aware of if I come here? What are the challenges? And that often, if people were honest, led to some very, in other words, what am I getting into if I come here? Help me as best you can. And one other final note that came to me as I read this, a reminder that our value in God's sight is not determined or controlled by the approval of others. So I may fear rejection, but ultimately, someone else's approval should not be our highest priority. Thank you.
Don?
Well, it works. I always look for what works with a Sunday school class or a discussion group, and the question you ask works. I mean, it's, so ask the question. You're probably going to get great feedback from any class or virtual discussion group. I'm thinking back to a sermon I heard, I guess about 6 years ago. Nancy Kahan was in the pulpit at Palmacia Presbyterian Church in Tampa, Florida, and she preached on this. In which she grabbed my head, turned it away from fear toward what is the meaning of discipleship. And I had made some notes about it, about how it's important to, Bill, you're talking about call out fear, because it's always there. I don't know if this is a call to be fearlessness. This is a call to understand what fear is and what it does. And I think as a child, when I was a child and I thought as a child, I read it as fearlessness, and it was daunting. And I don't think that's what this is. It's about saying the word. This is what fear is. This is the thing that you're afraid of. So you call it out, that it's intensified by crisis. It's accelerated by our collective behavior. All the things we recognize when there's fear. It creates false objectives. It creates false goals. It harms community. And when Nancy was preaching on this, she used the FDR quote, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," which when I was younger was confusing to me. I'm not from that time, but it was still resonating. People could give testimony to what that meant. So it was riveting to me, and it seemed to be a call for fearlessness. But now as I listen to it, I'll just do a few quotes from her sermon. It causes the failure of discipleship. So, Sarah, it's raising the question for me is, what is discipleship if it causes the failure? And maybe, Bill, discipleship is to call out fear, to say this is what's present in our hearts. This is what you're going to come across as you travel. She said, fear limits and constrains life. It's true. It rivets the brain to the object of the fear. She said it creates tunnel vision. And if you know anything about fight or flight syndrome that we all have, and many of us to an extreme, that's one of the aspects. You actually do get tunnel vision physically when you have the flight syndrome. Peace and hope are the new reality, and there is no alternative to that vision. It reminds us of those things. So for a class, what you could do is replace the word fear, like we have nothing to fear but fear itself, with the results. And it might create a great discussion where you'd say, I have nothing to fear but thinking cloudily, hiding. We have nothing to fear but rushing to conclusions. We have nothing to fear except the misuse of data and facts. We have nothing to fear but the inability to solve problems. We have nothing to fear but our own retreat. We have nothing to fear but the collapse of community. We have nothing to fear but the loss of our sense of what discipleship is supposed to mean. And Sarah, my final note is, I sure understand what you mean, Charles, by not knowing what Jesus meant, what he was thinking. But there is, as a part of discipleship, a commonness that the human condition includes fear. And Jesus calls that out, that we are united in that one, that we all are going to have at different levels and different intensities. The four of us have a lot more in common than we give differences, but we are going to have intensities of fear through our lives, our own apocalypses. And I think, I may not know what he's thinking, which I agree, but I do believe he's calling out something that unites us, something that limits discipleship, that's part of the human condition. Sarah?
Oh, I like that answer. Don, that really resonates with me. So you all know that I have a 22-year-old man that lives in our house. He's a bit of a recluse. He spends a lot of time with fear in his pocket. And so one of the things that I often did as a parent was he would present me with the why would I want to do that question. Why would we want to go to Disney World? And I would have to come up with an answer that was convincing to get him in the car. Why would I want to eat a plum? They don't look very appetizing. I don't think they're going to taste very good. And I would have to come up with, you should eat a plum because fill in the blank. So I think one of the things we work against as we're practicing the fine art of following Christ is we work against the presumptive idea that how could anything be better than where we are right now? And one of the things that's important is to feel the pinch, so to speak, to move forward enough that we step and make the effort to move forward or to go. And I think the the importance of this is you see things that get broken so that things can grow. Peach pits, for example, they have to be broken so the peach will grow into a new peach tree. So I'm spending some thoughtful energy in why do we have to leave that which is so comfortable to move towards something unknown? And Jesus does a really good job in this passage of articulating some of those characteristics that I encounter as I try to move forward. And I think for a parent, I'm used to having this kind of conversation with my oldest child in an effort to encourage him to grow. So I'm looking at these words as, Sara, to grow, you need to do these things. And not be concerned about what people will say, to not necessarily be concerned about the things that cause anxiety and fear, maybe not knowing, but being prepared to move forward with open hands and bring the gospel. So I think that the calling out of the family, the calling out of change, the calling out of how your reputation will be treated are some of the anxiety points that any human has as they try to move forward. I will say that, my mother was not a big fan of black-eyed peas. And I never ate black-eyed peas growing up until I met my husband. And he introduced me to black-eyed peas, and I thought, where have these been all my life? So there's something about changing what you grew up with and moving openly into the future a little bit and enjoying the black-eyed peas. So that being said, I think it's important to tease out with some detail those things that you're afraid of and really give them some good consideration in an effort to not be paralyzed when you encounter them. It's helpful when you're on an airplane to remember all the sounds that the airplane is going to make to assuage your anxiety about flying. The sound of the cranks when they move, the flaps up or down, can be terrifying if you don't know that's what they are. So I think sometimes knowledge helps dissipate anxiety and fear. So I like the idea that Jesus was doing that for the disciples and for us. Question number 2. Fear has an easy and powerful grip on humanity. Fear can drive perceptions, ignite reactions, and paralyze decision-making in both positive and negative ways. In thinking about the ways in which Christ moved through fear-charged situations, in what ways are we called to act or move or respond when fear is our companion? Don, you want to go first?
Okay. Fear is not a companion. Maybe that's the start. It can't be a companion. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in Christian thinking. So it's something to be rejected. We use companionship in terms of the last mile. You carry something for someone. We have all kinds of companionship. Disciples go out in groups. It goes back to the question we had in the first question, what is discipleship? And discipleship is companionship. And we have the alongside of the paraclete as well. There are other kinds of companions. So I think in this case, it's back to the first question, something to be aware of, something to call out, something you need friendship with to walk beside. It's really about where you're abiding, who you're walking with. And before we started recording this call, because we have a Zoom version, so we actually look at each other for those listening on the podcast only. And Sara Mickelson brought out a loaf of bread that I think you made last night, right? Yep. And so you started this. You said companion, and companion is a word in modern sense that means accompanying another or a comrade. which means you reject the comradeship of fear. This is, I think, about rejection in the name of discipleship. One employed in the service of another, that gets kind of, if you apply fear to that, that's downright creepy. Fear is your companion. Fear is someone that serves you. This gives me clarity of thinking. And then the word companion, for you Latin scholars, and Charles, you could comment on this, I think, companion and companis, is that right, Charles? Which means with bread. So, Sara, you brought out the bread this morning, and so I think it means who you dine with. You want to use that word. And for companionship, in the old language, you probably must eat with them. You must dine with them. So I like what you've done because it creates the need to reject, to call out fear, to reject it, because we are called to be companions to each other in discipleship, and we also have one that walks alongside. So this one primes for rejection, I think. It's my best shot there.
What do you think, Bill?
I'm unmuted, right? Okay. Don, again, to springboard from you and to illustrate the nuances, the levels of this, a quick story. Some years ago, prior to the infamous, sad incident elsewhere in Florida, I, in our community, was a part of a neighborhood watch group, a healthy one, and we were appalled at what happened in the incident where the neighborhood watch person ended up killing somebody. That's not what we were about at all. We were neighbors looking out for neighbors. And the consultant from the police department did an interesting thing. He virtually required us to read a book entitled The Gift of Fear. The Gift of Fear. And the point of it was it's got some horrible examples in it where people very naively let a very dangerous person literally into their apartment or what. In other words, they didn't pay attention to signals that something was amiss. And the book wasn't trying to have us be fearful. And we talked about that, we could use other synonyms, but there is a gift to the word we might prefer as Christians is discernment. Don't trust everything that you hear. There are wolves in sheep clothing. I think just last week we talked about the be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. So that fear can be a signal to us of potential risk. Then I think this gets maybe for what you're saying, Don, rather than embracing that and I liked your language, it can drive perceptions, ignite reactions, and paralyze decision making. That's a helpful way to phrase it. I think it's accurate. If I recognize that there's potential risk, then I'm better prepared to deal with it. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here. And that gets to another point I wanted to make. Over the years, when people have come to me as a pastor about this, how dare Jesus say, don't be afraid? Or how dare he say, forgive our enemies? Doesn't he realize how difficult it is? And my response was, given modern day psychology, it's not healthy to tell you don't feel what you feel. If you feel sad, it's not appropriate for me to tell you don't feel sad or don't grieve. You feel what you feel. I think the nuance is, do not let your feelings ultimately control you. Now, maybe I'm taking some modern day insights and superimposing them back over 2,000 years. That's possible. But I do believe Jesus is saying to us, don't be, to use your language, Sara, don't be paralyzed by fear. Don't let fear drive your life. It's there, and there are things. Jesus said, remember, fear those who can destroy the essence of you, whatever that means fully. So, again, Jesus does say there's something to fear. Now, and I think I've quoted this recently. I forget who came up with it. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in the face of fear. That's what I'm getting at, that the not being controlled by it. Now, I am not a fan of cutesy acrostics, but recently, given our context nationally and internationally, maybe you've seen this. Someone has come up with two phrases based on FEAR. I wish I could put this up. It'd probably be better to see it. There are two ways that you can understand fear: forget everything and run, or face everything and rise. Now, again, I don't want to go too far with cute acrostics, but that face everything and rise, that's how we grow. That's how we build self-esteem, is by facing into challenges and not running from them. Doesn't mean we're always the winner, but it means we grow, and that gets into the next question, Sarah, and I'll reserve my other comments for the third one. Thank you.
Charles, you want to weigh in? You're muted.
Just a couple of comments. I think fear is inevitably paralyzing. Fear it stops you in your tracks, and it as you've suggested, it dramatically narrows and focuses your vision on basically two options: fight or flight. And I'm not sure that I can find a positive use of fear unless you think the flight part's positive, so that you get out of the way. But I think I prefer the phrase. I don't know, how was I going to put it here? Oh, yeah, I would prefer to use the word concern than fear, because concern enables you to bring your thoughtful, creative, analytical processes into whatever it is that you're working on. Concern is a less binding, a less controlling, and a more liberating way of reacting to problems and issues that you encounter. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. So I was considering how Jesus moves through fear-charged situations. And in considering that, thinking of it as a model on how I might follow him. And I think we've teased out a little bit that articulate or define that which is the high anxiety point. I think fear can be a perception and not a reality. And that the perception becomes larger than life. And the reality is kind of taking a bite-sized chunk down and really looking at that which causes you that anxiety, so that you may, if you will, bring it down to size instead of letting it be inflated or catastrophizing it, which is a favorite phrase right now in our home. Thinking about fear makes us jump to conclusions. Fear makes us doubt our neighbors. Fear makes us, as you would say, Don, break down community. And part of what I love about the word companion is to dismantle fear of neighbor, you have to break a meal with them. The bread being such a characteristic of the body of Christ, to move between neighbors, to engage around a common meal is such a gift. When you think about the Last Supper and what Jesus did for us by modeling that, So I think fear is, again, a healthy concern. Fear can be blown out of proportion. Fear can put us in a position where we act with caution instead of running in with a brash perspective. So I like fear, and I'm not uncomfortable with fear being a companion. I just don't want it to drive the car. And I think it's important, I say this to my daughter, don't walk into a situation without knowing what is going to go on. Don't cross a threshold without knowing who's in the home. Don't imagine in naivete that everybody works and thinks the same way you do. So I try to introduce her gently into the idea of caution for safety. And I think that that's important. I think that we all need to pay attention to that which our soul speaks to us and tells us no, and recognize when the body of Christ would have us change the perspective about fear and become a person that can see that which gives others fear and be able to go, let's look at that closely. Let's take that apart. Let's dismantle that a little bit so that we can bring it back down to size and really come to terms with what is that fear telling us? Because I think fear is a natural response to things. I think fear is valuable. I think fear is easily used and misused by so many. One of the marketing strategies, Don, you'll acknowledge this, is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. If I can make you be fearful, uncertain, or doubt, you will buy my product because my product will save you from your fear, your uncertainty, and your doubt. A simple help, I've fallen and I can't get up is all you need to be told. That is fear, uncertainty, and doubt marketing. If someone makes me fearful, my question is why? My question is, who's going to win if I'm afraid? Who might be using my fear to their advantage? And these are all questions I'm asking myself on a regular basis these days. And stepping back and going, do I have enough information, or is this conflated? Has this been catastrophized so that I will be paralyzed? And my job is to say, let me get a flashlight. Let me get a microscope. Let's take a look at this. So I think it's important to recognize and acknowledge fear as something important, but not something that becomes the main focus. And I think that's important from a perspective of how Jesus walked through fear-charged situations. I mean, everybody's holding rocks ready to throw, and Jesus is doodling in the sand right in front of this person that's going to be stoned and goes, well, here's the thing. If you've never sinned, go ahead. Throw the stones. And that was such a simple phrase, but such a call out to protect that person from being stoned, but also to challenge the group, the mob that was moving with fear toward this woman. So I think that's important for us to say to each other, wait a minute, what are we really seeing? So that leads me to my third question. Jesus speaks of conflict with neighbors, friends, family in this passage. In truth, some say conflict is essential or a necessity for growth. Can you recall a time when conflict brought you spiritual growth or provided an unexpected forward pathway for you? Bill, you want to take a shot?
Yes, I am unmuted, right? I'm a little anxious. A couple of introductory comments, and then I will get to your question about my own personal journey. We're aware of the phrase, the offense of the gospel. That word is used various times, according to my search in the New Revised Standard Version, there are 6 or 8 references to it with some nuances that I'll get to. Over the years, I've read more than one commentator talk about that idea of the offense of the gospel, and that it's important to be careful. Is the offense my personality, my need to be right, or is the offense the gospel? And that can be a challenge. And at one point in my life, as I began to deal with my addiction to people pleasing and was seeking to, with counseling and other things, to move through that, I was sharing with a colleague once that some stories and saying, I wonder if I'm still trying to be too nice. And he said to me, you know, Bill, there's a time and a place to offer a winsome witness. I still remember that phrase. You don't always have to be in someone's face or challenging someone. There's a place for a winsome witness. And a scholar, Greg Carey, in getting at the offense of the gospel, uses the example of Clarence Jordan of Cornelia Farms, and way ahead of his time in Georgia, challenging racial segregation. And he described Clarence Jordan's life as not peace but a sword, clinging not to fathers and mothers but to Jesus, cling not to this life but get your life for the sake of Christ, no middle of the road, no conciliatory Christianity here, no compromise, no accommodation, no middle path. There is an offense to the gospel, and it was highly offensive to many Christians during the struggle over racial segregation. Another way to say it, there's the risk that we may play the martyr. In other words, to take up your cross. I've heard people say, you know, my cross is my wife, or my cross is my job. I don't find that too convincing. And there are people who, I think, and probably all of us at times, play the martyr, and we can say, well, I'm suffering because of the gospel, or because of, you know, I'm right and they're wrong. Now, so there are some caveats. Having said that, one of the times I first most powerfully encountered this was when I went off to senior college. I'd been at home in Orlando for junior college, and then I went off to Southwestern at Memphis, now Rhodes College, in the midst of the civil rights movement. And being a history major, I had begun to have my eyes opened. I had never questioned segregation. I mean, I look back and I go, how is that possible? But nobody in my life growing up was questioning. It's just the way things were. And I became convinced that it was wrong, and that desegregation, integration was what we needed. My first Christmas home, the first time I went back home after leaving in August to go to college, was at Christmas. And that was not a pleasant Christmas. When I began to voice my journey, well, you can let your imagination, and it was, in some ways, it felt like a retreat to go back to college after 2 weeks. And there was tension on the college campus. We weren't all of one mind there, but the anger and the bitterness, it was an eye-opener for me. I thought naively, well, I've had my eyes opened, and I'm not about having arrived, but I'm on a journey, and naively assuming that other people would appreciate my sharing that with them. Later, a church I was serving, just as the AIDS crisis was coming to be publicly known, and it was basically a death sentence, I and the session agreed for a professionally led support group for persons with AIDS to meet at the church. Again, I still remember standing in the pulpit on Sunday morning, the session having made this decision during the week before, and announcing at 2 services that this would happen. I had no idea. You talk about fear. There was a tsunami from some people of fear, and some people left the church. You know, we should not let those people in the church. And again, it's it's not to try to make me look like a hero, because one thing I learned, Don, you and I have been talking about leadership. I wasted my breath saying to people, this wasn't my decision. This was, in the Presbyterian world, the session made this. No, in their mind, the senior pastor had the bullseye on his chest and was the focus of unbelievable anger and hostile communications. Later, we got into Family Promise, ministry to homeless families with children, and they would stay in our building on a rotational basis. And again, the phrase from some, we don't want those people in the church. There is an offense to the gospel. And again, others and I would pray during that, it's not about arrogant. It's not that I'm the hero. That's not the point. But there is a point, and working for the persons on the margin is the point. That faithfulness to the gospel then, in fact, will offend other people. And in our current national and worldwide crises, it is difficult to maintain the unity of the Spirit and John 17, that they may be one. It is difficult. I'll end with a quote. Some years ago, I got to go to a public gathering to hear Martin Marty speak, a professor at the University of Chicago, a writer of many books, and I think rightly considered at his time somewhat of a trusted source of looking at the church. And he gave an overview of the church at that time. And then the first questioner got up and asked a very loaded question. The basis of it was an invitation to Martin Marty to condemn and dismiss fundamentalists. I don't remember what Martin said. It was a brief, and the questioner was not satisfied. He rushed back to the mic and said, in effect, I'm disappointed. I'm giving you a chance to dismiss these people. They are the problem. And Martin Marty leaned back and thought for a moment, and he said, there are a lot of things I could say, but let me cut to the chase. Over the years, I've worked in many projects to help people in Chicago and elsewhere. I'm a fan of what we can do to make things better for the greater good. Let me tell you this. I learned a long time ago, any day of the week, give me a warm, loving fundamentalist to work with rather than a cold-hearted, angry liberal. And there was an audible gasp in this audience, and by the location, one could safely assume the audience was largely very liberal. And I still remember that comment. And what he said was, the point is not to put people in camps, it's to work for the greater good. And if someone's a fundamentalist and they love people and they're willing to work alongside of me, I welcome them as a companion. So, what's that got to do with this question? It's, what's the offense? Is it that their ideology I don't like, so that I would miss the opportunity for them to be a companion in ministry? Again, it drives us to keep examining our motives and what's driving us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Charles, you want to weigh in?
Yes. I want to thank you, Sara, because your question prompted me to remember something that happened almost 60 years ago, and it's still vivid in my head. At that point, I was probably in my third year at Yale Divinity School, and a meeting was called to have a conversation about an issue that had emerged in the country, and that was a U.S. representative, a congressman, Adam Clayton Powell, had been charged with some offense in Congress, and the meeting was called to discuss our response as students to this issue. And I remember going to that meeting determined to make sure that Adam Clayton Powell didn't get an easy pass because he was black. And there was a young man who he was a couple of years behind me in the class, who came to the same meeting, and it turned out, as the conversation developed, that he had come to the meeting intending to make sure that Adam Clayton Powell didn't get blown away because he was black. And as the conversation developed, I was amazed to find that anybody could think that. And the person who made those observations is named Edward Good. He and I became best friends. Our relationship had matured. He went on to graduate. I went on to a PhD program. He went on to graduate and eventually became a pastor and served in the churches in Brooklyn and finally in Chicago. But he and I kept up with each other and became actually best friends. In fact, I invited Edward to come down to Princeton Seminary. I was arrogant in those days, so I just did things like that, and the seminary somehow put up with it. So I said I want him to come down and to co-teach an exegesis class with me. And they said, "Well, does he have a PhD?" I said, "No, he's a working pastor." And they agreed. And he and I put on what I have concluded modestly was the best Greek exegesis class ever taught on the campus of Princeton Theological Seminary. And we still correspond. Edward is now, as he put it, he said when, I asked him what he's going to do when he retired, he said, I'm going to retire. I'm not going to do anything. But he is. It's a remarkable friendship that has been alive, and to imagine that out of that conflict could emerge something that's lasted for 60 years, has matured, has grown. We've shared each other's sorrows. We've shared each other's gladnesses. It's just been a wonderful experience.
Thank you. Don?
Thanks. Just want to acknowledge what you said to start this section off, Sara, that fear can be weaponized for so-called, quote, good purposes. And I think that's part of what we're called to watch for on here. Discipleship is to listen carefully for when someone is weaponizing fear. And it's all around us. And especially in the kind of economic system that we work in, you can say it's good. You can weaponize fear for political purposes. And I think we're called to stand back and not to be quick to anger, but to listen very carefully. And then also on conflict, not just the weapon, but I don't believe conflict at its heart is good. I don't say conflict is good. I think it's a neutral term. What makes conflict good is the call that we have from the Old Testament to seek justice and love kindness. And if you're seeking justice with conflict, and I guess I have a JD, so I'm just thinking of it as an attorney, that you require a conflict in order to go to a court. And the Supreme Court requires facts, a true conflict. We don't work in this country. The justice system doesn't work around ideas, theory. You need conflict. But behind that is a process, which has a lot to do with counting to 10, discovering the facts, having an advocate at your side who can think clearly and not out of anger and fear. And you have a judge to manage the process so that we can cool down. So conflict is not red hot. Conflict is not war. When it's good, that you're seeking justice, and that has a responsibility. And it goes to what is discipleship. Fear is not your companion, it's discipleship. So I was thinking, to wrap up, we're about out of time. I'm not fearless. I don't know anybody that's fearless. There's no such thing. And I think if you read the passage in that way, then we're going to get messed up. And I think it messes up people. It messes me up when I've read it that way. I am not fearless. Matter of fact, I'm afraid of the call to be fearless. Right? That's a problem. I'm not fearless, but fear is not my companion. Because. And I think that's the challenge where you could do that with the class as well. I'm not fearless, but fear is not my companion because, fill in the blank. I seek justice. I love kindness. I have friends. I have friends who call out fear. I name what the fear is. I have a circle of people. I remember history. I cool down. I do not weaponize fear. I do not get angry in conflict. I mean, just fill in the blank. Fear is not my companion because, and again, I just want to show my heart, which is, yeah, and I also have to admit that fear is my companion sometimes. So that kind of question makes me think about it and to cool down. So I love your question, but my counter is, well, conflict is not good or bad unless fear is not your companion. And I see we've got about 2 minutes, Sara, to wrap up. You started this, so I'll give it back to you to summarize.
Well, thank you. I often observe nature and look for truth. And there are certain trees that cannot grow in full sun. A dogwood, for example. A dogwood has to grow up in the shelter of another tree because they're easily burned by the sun. So to get those beautiful blooms, you have to plant a tree close to another tree. When in nature or in a building where a particular joist might be cracked or failing, you have to sister another board to it, maybe one on either side, to help carry the burden. When a bone is broken, you need a stabilizing force on both sides of that bone to assist that bone with healing. So I think there's something lovely about recognizing that conflict is in this world. Chaos is a part of our experience. And one of the jobs we bear as Christ followers is figuring out how we can help each other in moments of conflict, in moments of crisis, in moments of chaos. And not add to the burden, not add to the conflict, not add to the chaos or add to the pain, but come alongside and bear witness and be ready for that where the Spirit will lead us. So I think that recognizing that we live in a broken world and that conflict is here and it won't go away, it's going to come back, it's going to show up, we have to figure out how to work with it. And we have to figure out how to help others. And I think that's our primary path. And maybe that's part of why Jesus came, to assist us, to help us learn how to be better companions to each other. I think that's a wonderful learning path. And all I can say is, I'll bring a flashlight.
Thanks, Sara.
That's all.
And as we wrap this up, I want you to know that Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And if you're listening in during the time of pandemic, there are many resources there, other discussions, maybe of this passage, sermons, reflections, prayers. So I commend that site to you if you're looking to connect in other ways. And you are always welcome, and we'll see you next time.